Hey everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this new format, where we continue to bring authors and their new books to the politics and prose community. As this is a new venture, please bear with us as we get out all the kinks and get more comfortable with this new platform. We want to bring your attention to the Ask a Question feature below. You can ask a question to David at any time during tonight's event. We already have a couple. And you can also upvote questions, and you can determine which ones you want the most, and we'll try to answer all of those. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on the Politics and Prose website. We're currently offering free media mail shipping on all domestic orders, as well as curbside pickup. And every purchase goes to support small businesses at a time when we truly need it the most. Also, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that the author, the host, and the other audience members cannot see you through the screen, so feel free to relax and get comfortable. And finally, we want to thank all of you so much for being here with us tonight. It's small businesses like Politics and Prose that especially need your support in times like these. So without any further ado, we are very pleased to welcome David Daley to Politics and Prose Live, celebrating his newest book, Unrigged. Daley is a senior fellow at Fair Vote and the former editor of Salon. He is the author of Rat Eft, which chronicled Republican gerrymandering efforts. David's new book, Unrigged, discusses ways in which Americans are fighting back to reclaim their democracy. And so now please join me in welcoming David Daley.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody at Live Right. Thank you, everybody at Politics and Prose, for making this happen. And let me just echo that. Politics and Prose needs you. This is one of America's great bookstores. It's been an amazing gathering point for readers, a host for important conversations. So let's help them out tonight. They've got plenty of copies of Unrigged, I'm sure, but lots of other amazing books, too. I've been reading Jesse Wegman's important new book on the Electoral College, Let the People Pick the President, and about to jump into Jenny Offel's new novel, and Michael Lewis's Fifth Risk just seems to have predicted all of this a couple of years ago, so I'll buy some books tonight. We could all use some optimism and some hope, and Unrigged, this new book, really began with a quest for hope. I'd written a book on partisan gerrymandering with that memorable title of Rat Eft. If you're going to write a book about partisan gerrymandering, it needs a memorable title. And that really first laid out the highly effective Republican strategy in 2010 to win state legislatures in competitive states like Ohio, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, just ahead of redistricting. And then they used this powerful new map-making software and data sets to redraw not only state legislature and congressional maps, but really the very essence of our democracy itself. There are now 59 million Americans, that's 1 in 5 of us, who live in a state where one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in 2018. And as of November 8th, 2016, 3 of those gerrymandered states, each of which had made it tougher for citizens to vote in important ways, handed Donald Trump the Electoral College by a margin of 80,000 votes. Americans woke up in a closely divided nation where all the political power in Washington, on the Supreme Court, and 70% of state legislatures was concentrated with one party, even when that party won fewer votes. The toxic combination of gerrymandering, closely followed by voter suppression laws passed by newly accountable legislatures, tied our democracy into this profoundly depressing double knot of unfairness and established this nearly unbeatable minority rule in otherwise competitive states. It was not easy to see a solution for this anti-democratic crisis that contributed so dramatically to the extremism and the polarization and often the hopelessness in our politics. I give talks about the book and sometimes feel like I had this dark rain cloud over my head. And then I saw a Facebook post by a young Michigan woman named Katie Fahey. On election night 2016, Katie left her job at a Grand Rapids recycling nonprofit. She put on her best red pantsuit and flew to New York with a golden ticket for Hillary Clinton's victory party. That evening did not go as planned, and 2 mornings later, before work, already fearful of the family Thanksgiving battles and the flying mashed potatoes that would soon be in the air, she took to social media. "I'd like to take on gerrymandering in Michigan," she wrote. "If you're interested in doing this as well, please let me know." Maybe it connected because of the smiley face emoji that Fahey added next, or perhaps because gerrymandering in Michigan had really severed the connection between the ballot box and the people's will. But that single post by a regular citizen pioneered a winning redistricting revolution in a state where no one thought it could happen, that marshaled thousands of volunteers, collected more than 425,000 signatures, raised almost $15 million, and won in November with more than 62% of the vote. Not long after that, I met Desmond Meade, who had taken on the difficult task of returning voting rights to almost 1.7 million former felons in Florida, who had essentially lost their civic voice forever, along with a conviction, even after they'd served their time. It was this cruel vestige of the Jim Crow South that ensnared 10% of adults in the state and 25% of African Americans. Meade knew that pain well because he was one of those silenced citizens. Drug addiction and deep depression had led to a felony weapons charge. One afternoon after his release, homeless, still struggling with drugs, Meade stood before the railway tracks outside Miami and he steeled himself to jump before the next oncoming train. The train didn't come that afternoon. Meade walked across those tracks instead, guided, he told me, as if by a higher power, suddenly found himself outside of a drug treatment center. He checked himself in, turned his life around, returned to college, even earned a law degree. But what he wanted was that right to vote. So Desmond Meade became the director of the Florida Rights Restoration Commission, and he built a coalition that united black and white, Democrats and Republicans, ex-cons and second chance believing churchgoers, tattooed Trump-loving deplorables and radical criminal justice reformers into this mighty moral movement funded by both the Koch brothers and the ACLU. And on Election Day 2018, even as Florida elected a Republican governor and Republican US Senator, 64% of the state backed a constitutional amendment that restored those voting rights. The state of Florida voted for fairness. Inspired by those stories and maddened by the culture-wide sense of despair, certain that we did not need another book about how democracy dies, I set out to join these quiet revolutionaries who were reinvigorating our civic fabric at exactly the time we needed it most. I watched regular citizens demolish barriers that experts had deemed too stout, too high, too imposing. I joined those voters, not politicians, canvassers, as they knocked on thousands and thousands of doors, door knocked across Utah and Missouri, where activists also won critical redistricting reform in red states. I watched Native Americans across the Red Rock Desert of Utah and the hardscrabble tribal lands of North Dakota mount desperate, heroic pushes to determine their street addresses and make themselves tribal IDs to preserve their voice against surgically focused ID bills. I rode the Medicaid Express, a green RV across Idaho with gutsy activists who didn't understand why their legislature wouldn't accept their own tax dollars back from the federal government to ensure 70,000 of their neighbors had health care, and they wouldn't accept no for an answer. In Alabama, where the state legislature, under court order, finally returned voting rights denied to tens of thousands of citizens released from prison, but refused to allocate a dime to actually register them, I went door to door, bus station to barbershop, with concerned citizens determined to add their neighbors back to the voting rolls. They won. They won big. They won everywhere. At a time when the news cycle feeds this never-ending exhaustion, it was just inspiring to ride alongside those who turned off cable news, got off of Twitter, and returned to work. In Idaho, that Medicaid expansion initiative began after recent graduates from a high school in the northernmost notch of the state, and now studying medicine and history, realized they had organizing skills that might help a much-needed school levy overcome bitter, well-funded opposition in their hometown. That victory made them hungry for more, and when they settled on healthcare as an issue, they painted that 40-year-old RV green, they dubbed it the Medicaid Express, and crusaded to every corner of the state collecting signatures. In a one-party state redder than Taylor Swift's lipstick, they captured 61% of the vote the old-fashioned way. They persuaded their neighbors that this was the right thing to do. In North Dakota, they don't even require voter registration. But in 2013, perhaps not coincidentally, after the Native American vote narrowly catapulted Democrat Heidi Heitkamp into the US Senate, legislators decided to pass a voter ID law that demanded something specific, a street address. They mandated the one thing that did not exist in tribal lands. The tribes kept knocking this back in court, but the politicians kept refining the law year after year, and finally, in 2018, weeks before Election Day, a judge okayed it. And so the tribes got to work. They lined up allies in academia who worked out geo-mapping coordinates. Volunteers purchased machines and created so many new IDs that they burned those machines out. The law directly threatened the vote of Native Americans, but on Election Day, they turned out in massive numbers to protect it. Turnout surged. The legislator who wrote the original voter ID bill, he not only lost his fourth term, he fell to a woman named Ruth Buffalo, now the first Native American Democratic woman ever elected to North Dakota's State House. These efforts, they were not led by politicians, they were not led by parties, they began with regular people. That's really where all of this started. While the political media pretended to, bust from its coastal bubbles once in a while and camp outside Midwestern diners in search of heartland white male wisdom, a new national activism emerged. Nationwide, everyday citizens asked how they could contribute, and they quickly found answers in their own hometowns. None of these battles were easy. Many of them were challenged in court. They needed to overcome garbage legal claims and multi-million-dollar negative ad campaigns and powerful special interests equally determined to defend their own status and influence. But this crucial battle had been engaged. A torch had been lit, and citizens took off sprinting. And state legislatures and local election boards created these complicated new voter ID requirements or closed precincts. They suddenly met organized howls of outrage, whether this was in rural Georgia, rustic Kansas, New Hampshire college towns, or across those Native American lands. Then those local legislators, long protected by friendly district lines that discourage good challengers and make it hard for anyone to raise the money to oppose them, had to run for their lives as a new generation of data-savvy activists, groups like Run for Something and Sister District and Flippable, trained newcomers and young people how to seek office themselves down ballot where it can matter most. In Maine, home to a rich tradition of independent candidates, citizens demanded a voting system that allowed them to rank all of their choices and avoid a plurality winner most people opposed. Both parties stood in the way, so determined Mainers gave long winter petition drives, not once, but twice, and won. While the Supreme Court dithered and delayed and then bitterly closed the doors to federal courthouses on partisan gerrymandering claims, however, people did not wait for judicial superheroes or democracy-saving silver bullets. They acted, they became the protectors of democracy that we all imagine the courts should be. At other times, the courts came through. Maine's Secretary of State, underestimated by Chris Kobach, who thought he might be the Democratic stooge on his Voter Integrity Commission, the hapless Alan Colmes to his Sean Hannity, stood up for the rule of law and the nonpartisanship of presidential commissions and shut that clown show down before Kobach could use it to call for a national voter ID law. In Kansas, a determined team of young ACLU lawyers then delivered the final blow, forcing Kobach to defend his half-baked notions of voter fraud, not on Fox News, but under cross-examination. They didn't just defeat him, a judge ordered Kobach back to school to complete remedial legal education classes. In Pennsylvania, spirited public interest attorneys joined forces with genius mathematicians and unraveled biased maps that had consistently elected 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats to Congress from this bluish-purple state. Democrats would win 52% of the vote, but they'd take just 28% of the seats. In court, they won a new map. That new map is now a 9-9 fair map, and they showed the nation a way forward beyond the US Supreme Court using state constitutions to fight partisan gerrymandering. None of this is easy. The forces that are lined up against reform do not quit. They don't quit when 64% of Floridians back an end to felon disenfranchisement. The legislature came back earlier this year and added a poll tax onto that. In Missouri and Utah and Michigan, gerrymandered legislatures worked to undo reforms passed by the people. In Idaho, 62% of the people only convinced the legislature to make it harder to put initiatives on the ballot in the future. While progressives fight hard on rigged maps to win back a seat at the table for the next round of redistricting in 2021, Republican lawyers and strategists behind closed doors at an ALEC seminar last summer are encouraging state legislators to redistrict based on citizen voting age population, not the traditional standard of total population. Much of this is based on a study done by the Republican redistricting mastermind Thomas Hofeller, who found that this would create districts that are whiter, more rural, and more conservative. This is why the Trump administration pushed for a citizenship question on the census. The Hofeller study, however, was uncovered by some of the same lawyers who won fair maps in Pennsylvania after his daughter heroically stepped forward and shared her late father's files for common cause. Here's the good news, though. As we all fill out our census form during these days of social isolation, there's no citizenship question, thanks to Stephanie Hofeller. Tens of thousands of Idahoans didn't have health insurance before Reclaim Idaho's fight. That number may be slightly smaller than originally hoped. It's still a huge victory in a state where that had seemed impossible. Michigan's Senate has tried to play games with how it funds its independent redistricting commission, but no matter what, the citizens are going to draw the lines in 2021. Fewer Floridians with felony convictions will be able to vote in 2020 than imagined, but anywhere from at least 300,000 to 650,000 have won back their civil rights and their civic voice. Not every victory will be won, some will be eroded, but there's these 2 steps forward before that half step back. And that in many ways is the history of voting rights. It's one of expansion, one of retraction. It's not a straight line forward. Our current fight is really the latest chapter in a struggle over the vote that's as old as the nation itself. We might like to imagine that our nation's history is one of ever-expanding suffrage with courts protecting and defending this fundamental freedom, but it's never been as simple as that. The struggle did not end with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, or with the Voting Rights Act, or certainly with the resounding passage of any of these democracy reforms on Election Day 2018. These struggles are as old as our nation, and they go on. Our frayed democracy, far more fragile than we imagine, will not be healed by any single election. And progress must not be measured by any individual win, but with the number of battles and people that are engaged. Keeping a democracy, it turns out, requires a lot of work. But what all of these stories show is that when regular citizens unite and fight for the kind of democracy they want, when they put their hands on Martin Luther King's long moral arc of the universe and pull down hard, that there isn't a structural barrier that won't buckle. I want to leave you with one of the more moving stories from reporting this book, a story from Alabama, and a woman named Sherry, who on the night she lost her voting rights forever, thought that this would just be any other teenage evening in 1990s rural Alabama. There were high school friends in a classmate's car. They went for dinner at a drive-through. Someone passed around a joint, and then they heard the sound of a police car rolling down the street and a couple of white officers wondering what that odor might be. There were probably many cops who might have looked the other way or let those kids off with a warning. Maybe in Tonier suburbs that same night, the exact same encounter went down differently. Sherry's evening ended with drug possession charges for everyone. In the eyes of the state, they were no longer just high school seniors, they were felons. And in Alabama, felons guilty of a crime involving moral turpitude, such as this minor possession charge, an offense so small it wouldn't even be a crime in the United States, forfeited their right to vote forever. Sherry was 17 and she'd never voted. Now she feared she never would. Her most important right as a citizen erased before she'd ever even had the opportunity to exercise it. I had no idea, she told me. We weren't even thinking about voting at all. But these laws from the Jim Crow era that were hardly consigned to history ensnared Sherry. 160 years after they were originally passed, Alabama's legislature ended moral turpitude for all but the most serious crimes. The trouble is, the state was determined to keep that news as quiet as it could. It wouldn't even update the forms, let alone notify people they could vote again or instruct parole officers to help. Citizens started going door to door, bus stop to bus stop, in search of these people. That's where I met Sherry and heard her story outside of a Birmingham bus station just after 6 a.m. one summer morning as she waited for a ride to the hair salon where she works. When I approached her and asked if she was registered to vote, she waved me away, embarrassed, uneager to respond. I told her we were out informing people about a change in the law and that a felony conviction no longer cost people a permanent right to vote. Her eyes just grew wide. She said, "I can't vote. I have this conviction." Entered the clipboard. As long as the crime wasn't treason or murder, we could sign her up to vote right there. And she's like, "It was just possession. We were 17. It was stupid. You mean I can vote?" We hand her the forms. We walk her through it. It takes a couple of minutes to hand her back her civic voice. By the end, there isn't a dry eye. "I've never voted," she said. "I was 17 and thought I never, ever would. This is unbelievable. I will be a lifelong voter." This is who we're fighting for. This nation has been built by people. It's been improved by the people, whether these are the women walking for suffrage or the marchers across Selma's Pettus Bridge. Progress has been long, progress has been hard, but it has been of our own making. And now that responsibility to fight for progress belongs to us, to all of us, believing in principle over partisanship, up together by the belief that change belongs to us all, that equal protection belongs to us all, that one person, one vote means us all. We know that our democracy is broken. More than that, I think we know that our democracy has been broken actively and intentionally by partisans who put their narrow ideological interests above all else, who choose to aggressively gerrymander, suppress votes, and ignore the will of the people, rather than committing themselves to listen to and represent everyone in a vibrant and ever-changing nation. This danger predates the election of any president and will not disappear with a different one. Our civic and institutions and spirit could well suffocate from these toxins, but democracy requires tending and defending, sometimes against long odds, sometimes against our own leaders who rig the system to benefit their side. We're coming for you, though. We're taking it back. There is something that has been lit within the American people. We've got citizens who have never before joined a protest, who took to the streets, who circulated petitions, who stepped forward to run for office, who launched new organizations or joined movements that reimagined what democracy might mean. They dreamed a different future, ignored those who said the work would be too hard, or scorned their efforts as irrelevant, or warned that the odds of victory seemed far too uncertain for such a monumental lift. Then they devoted long hours and came together by the thousands. On RVs, in courtrooms and bus stations, at the doors on frigid winter mornings, and they made those dreams real at the ballot box, winning resounding majorities of their fellow citizens, inspiring Americans in red states, in blue states, in every state, who still believe that all political power is inherent in the people, that all legitimate authority depends on the consent of the governed, that representative democracy must represent us all equally. The lessons of Katie Fahey and Desmond Meade and all of these volunteers is that we do not need superheroes or the perfect presidential candidate to save us. We can be the solution. These battles on behalf of what's right, led by millennials, by former felons, by suburban women, by Americans of all ages and races who refuse to believe that creating change was beyond them, are the proof. There is a mighty unrigging underway, and I hope that this story leaves you with the same rebirth of optimism and hope that it did for me. I thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, David. That was incredible, and I think we all have a lot to think about now. I just want to remind everyone to look at the green button right under the screen where you can purchase David's book, Unrigged, from the Politics and Prose website. We please encourage you to do that right now. So let's take the first question. This first question comes from Alicia. I kind of feel lost as a grassroots organizer. Face-to-face is my game, baby. What are you hearing from other organizations across the country? What does grassroots organizing look like during a pandemic?
I think it's a challenge, right? I think we have seen that a lot of organizations mounting petition drives and trying to create change are having a hard time. This is a tricky moment. A lot of the really creative ideas, trying to set up a table and, leave pens and papers there for people, really difficult. Some of the online organizing tools, mailing petitions to people's houses, I think are hard. But, this is a moment that I think we all believe will pass. It will take time, but we will not be the same country on the other side of this. And I think we just have to get ready for the kind of organizing that's going to follow. I mean, maybe this is a breather. Maybe this is where you gather your strength and get ready for the really serious and important fights that are going to come as we rebuild this country the way we want it rebuilt once the things return to good health.
Okay, our next question. Can you comment on Trump's moves towards expanding governmental power in the light of global crisis? How do you think this will affect the election? Are we, without noticing it, moving towards even greater voter suppression?
We have to be really careful right now that a public health crisis doesn't also turn into a democracy crisis and a constitutional crisis. There are elections that are being canceled, postponed, primary elections that have been thrown into chaos by this. You saw it in Ohio just a week ago. The governor saying the night before an election that it would not be safe to conduct it. He was probably right, but boy, the chaos that ensued. We are going to have to think really seriously about how we conduct the election in November. We are going to need to radically expand vote by mail quickly and thoughtfully, and to ensure that we do so in a way that does not trample on representational rights, but that also ensures a fair outcome. This is going to be a real challenge. It's a heavy lift to create vote by mail in states. The places that have done it, it's been over time. It's been perfected over years, and they're always making it better and finding where the quirks are. We've got 7 months to figure out how we protect an election while also trying to put an economy back together and ensure that the country isn't ravaged by a pandemic. All of this is going to be deeply, deeply challenging, but we've got to be thinking about this election right now and what we do to safeguard it. Voting by mail, I think, is a very important first step. It's going to take a lot of money and a lot of organizational moves to get it ready.
Okay. We have one here from Sam. Can you talk about if you plan to do any virtual book tours and how people can do virtual book clubs? Several Reclaim Idaho volunteers are interested.
I thought that might be you, Sam. Yes, absolutely. I will do any virtual book clubs and events that anybody would like to do. I'd been very much looking forward to coming out to Idaho this month and to do all these events. And I hope that we'll be able to do them in person at some point. But in the meantime, let's do them online. And I know you all were in the middle of a really important signature collection for an education funding initiative out there, and we want to make sure that your volunteers remain engaged through all of this. So I think anything that we can do to help raise a little money and keep people active and energized, I'm on board for.
Okay. And just a reminder, if anyone does have a question, please use the Ask a Question box at the bottom. Next question comes from Joe. Luke Mayville and Katie Fahey could not be further apart in terms of their political familiarity in 2016. They both overcame institutional barriers set up to lock them and other regular citizens out from other established democratic processes and institutions. How do we get people with this level of charisma turned on to leading these types of movements? And how do you quickly signal to existing institutions and state players that these new leaders are worth early investment?
It's a great question. Katie was just a phenomenal spokesperson for that movement. It's really, Michigan, and if this is the Joe who I think it might be, you know full well that Michigan is where they say good ideas go to die. It's really, really hard to make change there. People had tried to fix redistricting forever, and there's a lot of powerful organized interests, the Chamber of Commerce on down, the DeVos network in the state, that just makes it brutally difficult. And I don't know if this happens if the person out front isn't a young woman, nonpartisan, determined to bring change, cheerful and optimistic. It was not, it was not me out front warning about the dangers of gerrymandering. It was not some a boring middle-aged white guy. It was a young, enthusiastic, a woman fired up about how important this was for a democracy and talking about it in ways that everybody could understand. And I went across Idaho with Luke, and it's just amazing to watch the charisma and just how he can take a room of citizens and just break down these complicated ideas and leave them fired up and signed up as volunteers afterwards. It's wild to think that you could expand Medicaid in Idaho with 61% of the vote. So I think that's right. There's a new book out about political hobbyism by a Tufts professor, and he looks kind of down his nose at political hobbyists. He says politics is for power in the title of this book. I would say that those people who made all of this change, we started as hobbyists, right? And they understood how to create change and how to wield power more effectively than any of these partisans. They brought the partisans around to their side. That's power. I talked with the Maryland Congressman Sarbanes about the For the People Act. He was the main mover behind that House bill. And he said that his colleagues in the House didn't think any of these democracy issues really mattered or that people cared about them until they would go to all of these town halls, and nobody believed them when they said they were going to make a change or get anything passed, because the people in this room understood that gerrymandering and the filibuster and campaign finance and all of these things stood in the way of getting any government enacted. It stood in the way of compromise. It stood in the way of government functioning properly. And only when they started talking about reforms did they get the people in that room nodding along. So I think that the political hobbyists perhaps know a little bit more about power and how to use it, and that there's a lot of people who want to take notice of that.
Okay, Marta would like you to please repeat the name of that title you mentioned in the beginning that predicted this mess we're in. I think that was the Michael Lewis book.
Oh, that's the Michael Lewis book, The Fifth Risk. He does early on in the first days of the administration, he reports on how poorly the administration was doing at taking seriously the job of staffing the government and getting ready for things, like a pandemic. That the basic functions of how government works, run by career professionals who are experts in their field, was just being slowly dismantled by the incoming administration. And as I read the first couple of chapters last night, it was horrifying to just see it all come to life.
Okay. This one comes from Diella. Hi, David. Thank you for making it clear this is an issue of partisanship. Oh, I lost the question. Issue of partisanship regardless of party. As a grassroots organizer fighting to end gerrymandering in Virginia, do you have any advice for addressing opposition and misinformation from the left? I've had a number of conversations with progressives who don't think their party will do this or are even fine with it as long as it's the Dems.
Yeah, that's really frustrating. And amazing job in Virginia, by the way. You won reform again in a state where nobody thought it was possible. What happened in Virginia was amazing. You're on the way to a constitutional amendment there that got through both chambers of the legislature 2 years in a row. It didn't look good this year, but the folks that won Virginia have just done a magnificent job of organizing there. I think that it's a complicated question. I mean, what we need to keep in mind, I think, is that all of these reforms win with upwards of 60% of the vote. Whether you're talking about redistricting in Missouri or Michigan or Colorado, it's upwards of 60%. And in Ohio, it was 70%. Felon rights restoration in Florida is in the mid 60s. Ranked choice voting in Maine, the same thing. So voters, I think, don't necessarily see this as a political issue, as a partisan issue at this point in time. It's politicians who are treating it like it's a partisan issue. And I think we saw that in Virginia during this last go-round. You had, a number of politicians on the Democratic side who were like, well, now we're in power and we're going to try to tweak this and fix this in such a way that we can draw these lines and control this process. And there were enough courageous Democrats who stood up and said, no, this is wrong and we're going to fix it. And we're going to have elections that are won and lost based on ideas, not where district lines are drawn. The people remain on your side on this, because in red states and blue states and purple states, these reforms are some of the last things that aren't seen through partisan footballs, through partisan lenses. And I hope it can stay that way. It's tricky, but it has to stay that way, especially as we try to talk about how to salvage an election this fall. If we wait too long to try to fix it and vote by mail and all of these questions become seen through partisan lenses, it's a recipe for a real meltdown.
Okay. This one comes from Sarah. Did you learn any lessons about maintaining optimism in the face of such massive challenges while writing Unrigged?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, I was. This book started with me needing some optimism, talking about partisan gerrymandering and the how depressing the system had become and how rigged it was against us. Really wore me down, and I often felt like I was absolutely sucking the air out of every room I was in talking about this, especially since there were so many people after the 2016 election who wanted to get off the sidelines. And I'd be like, yeah, this is not going to be easy. And it was looking for those examples that sort of fired me back up again. And, I realized that people were determined to, fight back for this democracy. And not only were they fighting back, but they were winning. And it was so, it was amazing just an absolute honor to be able to, in the middle of such tough times when the news cycle can be so just draining, and you wake up in the morning and you look at your phone and you go, oh no, what happened since last night? And to go out and ride across Idaho in an RV with volunteers who were going to take on Medicaid in a red state, or to go out, and knock on doors in Michigan with volunteers who managed to become the first group to put an initiative on the ballot without having to resort to paid petition collectors. I mean, it was amazing to go out to Utah and watch these Native Americans whose rights had been trampled on in San Juan County for 140 years, dating back to the time of Brigham Young in these towns, and they were determined to win back the county council that had been gerrymandered against them for decades, and they were out there campaigning and doing the work, and it was absolutely inspiring to watch all of this, and it was a joy to be able to write the book and to tell these stories, and I hope that they leave other people who might have had the same sense of defeatism as I did, that there is a road back, and it starts with all of us.
Okay, our next question comes from Paul. What are some ways that some of these movements have learned from each other, benefit from each other's experiences, victories, and setbacks?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think especially on the redistricting front, what you've seen is every time that a new commission is proposed, folks have learned a little bit from the ones that came before. So, one of the really early reforms, came in Arizona, and they created a 5-person commission, and it's largely political appointees and one independent chair, selected through the appellate court process. And very quickly, the politicians figured out how to sort of exert maximum pressure on that commission, and it wasn't working the way that people had intended. So when California went and did their commission in 2010, they learned from that, and they established, much bigger commissions, 14, 15 people. And they said it's not going to be enough to simply win a majority, because then you could have 2 groups, Democrats and independents could team up against the Republicans, or Republicans and independents could team up on the Democrats. So you have to have a supermajority support within all 3 groups to pass a map. And we're going to make people justify the decisions they made at the end by sort of writing essays about it. And you could see how in Michigan and Colorado, the reformers there were able to sort of take the pieces that worked in California and then add those reforms into their own proposals. So I do think that there's, a lot of this happening. In Florida, there was an awful lot of focus group testing on sort of messages that would work. And I think what folks found there, as far as, talking about fairness, talking about second chances, is the kind of messaging that will be able to be used in other states when talking about this. And there's a lot of, great national reform groups that are doing a lot of this work as well, and kind of in communication with local groups and, folks on the ground doing this same work as we head towards 2020.
Okay. We have Jackie saying, just saying hi, friend.
Hi, Jackie.
And then we have one last question from Paige. In what ways do you see technology either assisting or hindering grassroots movements? Are there certain types of technology that you see which can bring together people? So many of your stories are about the power of bringing together people in person. So I'm wondering if there were any themes or trends you're seeing.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I do a chapter in the book on some of the mathematicians and the political scientists who are using technology in amazing ways to sort of see through the work that's been done by partisans to, stick precincts, to divide precincts in such a way as to be deliberately confusing, or to, measure the impact of, voter ID bills or registration bills that require college students, for example, to, register to vote at their home address as compared to their university address. And then there's the amazing work that's been done by mathematicians on gerrymandering and redistricting that has done so much to convince the courts, and I think probably should have convinced the Supreme Court if they'd been willing to listen to it. I think those judges probably went in with an agenda and their eyes closed to some of these new mathematical standards, but a lot of other judges on the federal and state benches have been much more open and receptive to this. And in many ways, the big gerrymandering efforts in 2010 were made possible by these huge data sets and all of the information that is available on all of us, and these new computer mapping programs that make it possible to just, in a really surgical and sophisticated way, go up and down streets and draw lines. And in these really, really polarized times, where you draw the lines can make every difference, and you can almost be certain that these lines will last a decade. When we were not as polarized, when the data was not as precise, you could have a gerrymander backfire. You haven't really seen any gerrymanders backfire this entire decade. Those lines have still been very stout, but the mathematicians have come up with all of these tremendously creative ways of showing how biased these maps are. Moon Duchin at Tufts, and Wes Pegden at Carnegie Mellon, Jonathan Mattingly at Duke, Jonathan Rodden at Stanford, a lot of folks doing just incredibly impressive work. And if the technology is what has brought a lot of these gerrymanders about, it's going to be people using the technology for good that helps undermine them once and for all.
So we actually had one more question come in from Kathy. David, thanks for your book telling the stories of the democracy movement. I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of these stories were led by political outsiders who did not play by the institutional reform playbook. Could you say something about what you have learned about the importance of reforms being led and created from the ground up, and how that helps maintain the reform once passed?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because all of these reforms, a lot of them have come under attack, right, by legislatures after they're enacted. And when these are groups that are led by people, when these are ground up reform organizations, people who really feel like they've got their own hard work in the game, these groups stay together. What you see in Michigan, Voters Not Politicians, what you see in Idaho with Reclaim, in Florida with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, in Maine on ranked choice, these coalitions held together because they knew that they were going to have to defend their victories. And they didn't think that their fight ended once they won that first win. They understood that it was going to take holding together and then defending that victory. So I don't think it's any coincidence that these were run, often by newcomers, by outsiders, and I don't think that's any surprise that a lot of them were run by women. If you watch the new documentary "Slay the Dragon," that is in some theaters right now about gerrymandering, and that tells a lot of the story of Michigan. When they win at the end, sorry for the spoiler, and they're celebrating this victory on election night, and you see these women who made this change. It's an extraordinarily powerful moment.
Okay. Well, thank you once again, David, for being here with us on Politics and Prose Live. I'd like to remind everyone to please click the link below to purchase David's book from pnp.com. And it is your support that is going to keep us going at times like these, especially right now. Our doors are actually closed. So we really need your help right now to attend more digital events, to shop online. Tomorrow we have another one of these coming up with Eduardo Porter for his book, American Poison. Also, if you enjoyed this event, you can click the follow button at the top of your screen to keep up on all the events that we're doing. And we hope to see you all again soon. So everyone, please stay read.
Thank you, everybody.